What's your view, and maybe for people that don't know, the specific legal protections that vaccine manufacturers have? Whereas like they could be sued for, other products, other pharmaceuticals out there, but there's a specific protection around vaccines. Can you talk about the history of that?
Yeah. So in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, there were more and more lawsuits during the early 80s, especially around the DTaP vaccine, the wholesale DTaP, because of what we said before, like the neurological complications. And so there was a lot of concern that the lawsuits would lead those companies to go out of business. Some of them were, because when you give a product to a child, let's say a vaccine, and it causes an injury of some sorts, which any product would, and vaccines do, and there are many things that are documented that it can do, then the payouts are quite big. And if you get a bunch of lawsuits for things that are tough to prove, but potentially provable or likely causative, then these companies will go out of business. And they were very worried that the companies would stop making vaccines, and that was going to be an issue. And so in 1986, they passed the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, which basically made it essentially illegal to sue vaccine companies. So they really have almost blanket liability. There are a few nuances to that, but basically you can't sue them, and you're suing the government if you have an issue under this act. And it's pretty cut and dry at this point. It's like they have a table of injuries from vaccines, and if you meet the criteria for one of those things under the table, then they'll give you a payout. It's a certain amount of money, and that's that. You don't really sue the company. And they really have liability from that, and there have been several $1 billion, paid out over the 30, 40 years that they've had that, and that's where we are today. They have even more protection when it was an emergency use authorization above and beyond that, but the regular vaccines are on this schedule, and the only way for you to be able to go after or even go after anything from the act is to sue for something that we know there's a cause and effect relationship. So you have to prove that. And if it's not proven, then they just say no. And the most classic case was the autism omnibus in the early 2000s, which they brought together all the cases. There was about 5,000 cases of people that were stating that they thought that vaccines caused their children's autism. And so they lumped them all together because it was so many cases. They used 6 test cases that they tried, and we're talking about, so you're suing the government, not suing the vaccine makers, and they had several court cases that went through that, and again, they didn't prove that they didn't win because they said there's no evidence to prove that the MMR causes autism or thimerosal causes autism. That's what the omnibus was about, but it's still backward speak because it's legal stuff. And that's been used to kind of prove, oh, well, vaccines don't cause autism. But they're looking to say, do we have the evidence to prove that vaccines cause autism? But it's correct. They didn't have that evidence. They didn't have evidence to say that it did because they didn't have that. So you can't say it. That doesn't mean that vaccines couldn't cause autism. They don't have the evidence to prove that it does. It's a difference. It's a subtle difference, but it's a huge difference. And the wording matters because a lot of these things have been used over the years to say the science is settled when it's not true. Because if you look at anything else, if you go back in time, you could have done the same thing. You could have sued cigarette companies for smoking, and doctors were giving out cigarettes, right? And these are good for your health. And if you sued them before we had more information, then they would say, no, smoking doesn't cause autism. We know that. There's no proof that smoking causes autism. No, we know that opioids don't cause addiction. They're not addictive. We know that, right? These are things that you know. We know that glyphosate doesn't cause cancer. We know that until somebody does the research to show that it does, which is really hard to do. And so they know this, and that's the way that things have been pushed over the years. And so it's really very difficult to prove something in the positive because you need really, really, really good studies to show it. And any weaker study, they say, that's not a good study. It was done retrospectively, even though all of their research is also retrospective.